All right, let's talk about one of the biggest questions in all of economics. Where do interest rates actually come from? Today, we're diving into two major competing answers. We're going to start with the simple, kind of old-school classical theory, and then see how the more modern loanable funds theory gives us a way more realistic picture of how the economy really works.
So this is the question we're tackling today. On the surface, it seems pretty simple, right? But to answer it really well, you have to have a rock-solid grasp of the details. Think of it like a puzzle. We're going to see exactly how economists sharpen their thinking to get a clear picture of our financial world. And I promise, by the end of this, you will know exactly how to nail this answer.
Here's our game plan. We'll start by breaking down that old-school classical view, figure out where it falls short, and then bring in its much-improved successor, the loanable funds theory. We'll put them side by side, show you a step-by-step guide to crafting a perfect answer, and then we'll even peek ahead to see what came next in economic history. Let's get into it.
So why does any of this matter? Well, because interest rates are basically the heartbeat of the economy. Understanding where they come from is absolutely crucial. This isn't just a boring theory off, it's the story of a major upgrade in how we understand our own world. Okay, let's get into our first theory. This was the original starting point, the first real crack at modeling what an interest rate is and how it's determined. You can think of it as the simple, elegant, but, as we'll see, kind of incomplete foundation for everything that came later.
The absolute key phrase to lock onto here is purely real phenomenon. What on earth does that mean? Well, it means that classical economists thought interest rates were only about tangible, real-world stuff, things like a factory wanting to borrow to buy a new machine or a family saving up their actual income. In their world, money was just a convenience. It helped you do these things, but it didn't have any real influence on the interest rate itself.
So the mechanics of this are beautifully simple. On one side, you've got people and households saving their money. That's your supply of capital. On the other side, you have businesses that want to borrow that money to invest. The interest rate, it's just the price that balances those two things out, making sure that every dollar saved finds a home in an investment. As for money, they saw it as just a veil, something that covers the real economy but doesn't actually change its shape.
And here's the big problem. It's a neat and tidy idea, but it's missing some massive pieces of the real world. I mean, what about banks? Banks literally create money when they lend. And what about the fact that people don't just save or invest? Sometimes they just want to hold on to cash, hoard it. The classical theory just has no room for any of that. And that is exactly why economists knew they needed a better theory.
So, to patch up these huge holes, economists came up with a much more realistic model. This is the loanable funds theory, and it gives us a much clearer picture of the financial system we're actually living in. And boom, right away, you can see the game-changing difference. The loanable funds theory says the interest rate is a combination of real and monetary factors. It's not just about saving and physical investment anymore, it's about the entire market for credit, for all the funds that are available to be loaned out. By the way, this is the theory that forms the basis for the model you'll find in pretty much any modern econ textbook, like Mankiw's Principles of Economics.
Now, just look at how much bigger our picture gets. The supply of loanable funds isn't just from savings. We're now adding in new bank credit, that's money created by the banking system, and something called dishoarding. That's just a fancy way of saying people are taking cash they'd stashed away, maybe under the mattress, and putting it back into the system. And on the demand side, you still have investment, but now you also have hoarding, people deciding to pull money out of the system to hold as cash. See, it's just a much more complete, realistic view.
Okay, so we've got the simple classical story and the more detailed, realistic loanable funds story. Now let's put them right next to each other to really hammer home why that extra detail makes all the difference.
This slide really lays it all out. On the left, the classical world. Neat, tidy, but totally unrealistic because it pretends money doesn't matter. And on the right, the loanable funds world, which accepts that, the financial system is a bit messier. It recognizes that what banks do matters, and that people's decisions about holding cash matter. That's the core of its superiority. It just does a much better job of reflecting reality.
All right, so you get the theory now. That's great. But if you're a student, your next question is probably, okay, how do I explain this on an exam to get full credit? So let's switch gears from just understanding the theory to actually applying it. I'm going to walk you through how to build a perfect A+ answer. Seriously, just follow this 5-step recipe. You're going to start with a super clear thesis statement right up front. Then, you briefly explain the old theory and point out its major flaw, that it ignores money. Next, and this is the part that really impresses people, you detail all the components of the loanable funds theory. Then you directly contrast the two, and you wrap it all up by restating your main point. It's a guaranteed roadmap to a fantastic answer. And here's exactly what a professor or a grader is looking for. You can see the difference between a good answer and an excellent one really comes down to the details. A good answer might just say, it's superior because it includes money. An excellent answer says how. It adds bank credit and dishoarding to the supply of funds and hoarding to the demand. That specific knowledge is what will push you into that top category.
Now here's something that's really important to remember in economics, or really any field of study. The conversation is never over. Theories are always evolving, being challenged, and being improved. So while the loanable funds theory was a massive step forward, it was by no means the final word on the subject. So if the loanable funds theory was such a big improvement, you have to wonder, what was the next big step? Because of course, the story doesn't just stop there.
Well, the next giant of economics to enter the stage was John Maynard Keynes, and he actually swung the pendulum to the complete other side, arguing that the interest rate was a purely monetary thing. Then later on, the famous ISLM model came along and brought everything together. It created this amazing synthesis of the real factors from the loanable funds theory and the monetary factors from Keynes. It's just a perfect example of how these big ideas are always in conversation with each other, building and improving over time.
And that brings us to the end of our journey for today. We've seen how economic understanding evolves, moving from a simple but flawed model to a more complex and realistic one, which leaves us with one final big question for you to think about. Looking at the wild economy we have today, what do you think is the biggest missing piece in our current theories? Something to chew on. Thanks for joining us.